Introduction. Osiris and the Resurrection of the Egyptian Book of the Dead by EA Wallis Budge. Introduction. Osiris and Resurrection. It will be noticed in reading the translation of the Book of the Dead given in this volume that the deceased is always identified with the god Osiris, and that he is frequently called by the god's name. And if the religious texts written for the benefit of the dead in all periods be examined, it will be found that from the fifth dynasty to the latest times, Osiris is always regarded as the king and god of the dead, and that Egyptian writers always assume the identity of the blessed dead with their god. Thus, in the text inscribed on the pyramid of Unas, the writer identifies the king with the god Osiris, and says to the god Tem, "O Tem, behold thy son, this motionless Osiris. Thou hast given him that whereon he may live. If he liveth, this Unas liveth. If he dieth not, this Unas dieth not. If he perisheth not, this Unas perisheth not. If he begetteth not, this Unas begetteth not. If he begetteth, this Unas begetteth." And throughout the religious literature, the deceased always claims that whatever was done by the gods for Osiris should also be done for him by them. The hymns addressed to Ra and other great gods dwell more on the majesty and power which they exhibit in heaven and upon earth than upon their goodness to man. But with Osiris the case is different, and it is evident that in the earliest period he was regarded more in the light of a god who could be known, and who is known more or less personally, if we may use the word, and he was of all the gods the one singled out to receive the petitions of mankind for everlasting life. It is impossible to say when Osiris began to be regarded as the god of the dead, and it is only from brief allusions that any history of him can be formed. Throughout the Egyptian texts it is assumed that the god suffered death and mutilation at the hands of his enemies, that the various members of his body were scattered about the land of Egypt, that his sister wife Isis sought him sorrowing, and at length found him, that she fanned him with her wings and gave him air, that she raised up his body and was united unto him, that she conceived and brought forth a child, Horus, and that he, Osiris, became the god and king of the underworld. In the legend of Osiris, as given by Plutarch, De Iside et Osiride, it is said that he was murdered at the instigation of Typhon or Set, who tore the body into 14 pieces, which he scattered throughout the land. Isis collected these pieces, and wherever she found one she built a tomb. After the death of Osiris, his son Horus did battle with Typhon, his father's murderer, and, in the words of the Egyptians, avenged his father. Notwithstanding the death and mutilation which the god suffered, the Egyptians firmly believed that he rose from the dead with a body perfect in all its members, and that corruption and decay had no power over him. This fact may be deduced from a large number of passages in texts of all periods, but in one in particular, which forms part of chapter 154 of the Book of the Dead, a definite statement of it occurs. The deceased says to Osiris, "Do thou embalm these my members, for I would not perish and come to an end, but would be even like unto my divine father Khepera, who is the divine type of him that never saw corruption. Let not my body become worms, but deliver me as thou didst deliver thyself. Homage to thee, O my divine father Osiris! Thou hast thy being with thy members. Thou didst not decay, thou didst not become worms, thou didst not waste away, thou didst not become corruption, thou didst not putrefy, and thou didst not turn into worms. I am the god Khepera, and my members shall have an everlasting experience. I shall not decay, I shall not rot, I shall not putrefy, I shall not turn into worms, and I shall not see corruption beneath the eye of the god Shu. I shall have my being, I shall have my being. I shall live, I shall live, I shall germinate, I shall germinate, I shall germinate, I shall wake up in peace. I shall not putrefy, my intestines shall not perish, I shall not suffer from any defect. Mine eye shall not decay, the form of my visage shall not disappear, mine ear shall not become deaf, my head shall not be separated from my neck, my tongue shall not be carried away, my hair shall not be cut off, mine eyebrows shall not be shaved off, and no baleful injury shall come upon me. My body shall be stablished, and it shall neither fall into decay nor be destroyed upon this earth. The oldest copy of this chapter is inscribed upon one of the wrappings of the mummy of Thothmes III, who reigned about B.C. 1550, and the latest is found in the Turin Papyrus, edited by Lepsius in 1842, which dates from the Ptolemaic period. From these extracts we see that the deceased bases his certainty of an everlasting life, which was to be lived in a body which was perfect in all its members, upon the assurance that Osiris died and rose again and lived in a body which was perfect in all its members. And it followed for the Egyptian that if Osiris did not die and rise again, his belief in a resurrection was vain. It is difficult to say with certainty whether the ancient Egyptian believed that Osiris endured pain and suffered death on his behalf or not, but it is quite clear that he believed there was some very definite connection between the resurrection of Osiris and of himself, and also that the god was able to raise him up and to give him everlasting life, because he himself had conquered death and risen, and had become the master of everlasting life. If the legend of Plutarch, which states that Osiris was once a man who lived upon earth, really represents an Egyptian belief, we may perhaps conclude that the manhood which was common to the god and to the suppliant supplied the reason why the prayers which are put into the mouth of the dead are always addressed to Osiris. At all events, closer personal relations existed between man and Osiris than between man and any other god. Moreover, for countless generations he was the type and emblem of the resurrection, and relying upon his power to give immortality to man, untold generations lived and died. The ceremonies connected with the celebration of the sufferings, death, and resurrection of Osiris were performed with great solemnity, and it has been thought that a representation of them took place annually in certain of his shrines. The forms in which Osiris is depicted on the monuments and in papyri are very numerous, but we need only refer here to those which concern him in his character as king, god, and judge of the dead. In papyri he is seated on a throne within a covered shrine. His form is that of a bearded mummy wearing the Atef crown, and he holds in his hands the crook and flail or whip, emblems of sovereignty and dominion. On the side of the throne, which rests upon a pedestal made in the form of a parallelogram, the symbol of that which is straight or right, is the emblem of the union of southern and northern Egypt, which typifies the sovereignty of the god over the whole land. The throne is sometimes placed upon water, wherein we may probably see the origin of the tradition of certain Eastern peoples, which makes the throne of the deity to rest above running water. Behind him frequently stand the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, and facing him, standing upon a lotus flower, are the four children of Horus. Thus seated, praise was offered to him in these words: "Glory be to thee, Osiris Un-Nefer, the great god within Abydos, king of eternity, lord of the everlasting, who passeth through millions of years in his existence. Praise be unto thee, Osiris, lord of eternity, Un-Nefer, Harmachis, whose forms are manifold and whose attributes are majestic. Those who have lain down, that is, the dead, rise up to see thee. They breathe the air, and they look upon thy face when the disk riseth on its horizon. Their hearts are at peace inasmuch as they behold thee, O thou who art eternity and everlastingness." In an address to Osiris by Thoth, which forms the 182nd chapter of the Book of the Dead. He is said to be the governor of those who are in the underworld, and to make men and women to be born again, the new birth being the birth into the life which is beyond the grave, and being himself everlasting, he had power to bestow eternal existence upon his followers. Concerning the form in which Osiris rose from the dead, the texts are silent, and nothing is said as to the nature of his body in the underworld. That he dwelt in the material body which was his upon earth there is no reason whatever to suppose, for there are indications in the texts which point to a definite belief in the resurrection of a spiritual body, both in the case of the god and of men. Before, however, this point is touched upon, reference must be made to the ideas which the Egyptians held concerning the component parts of man's entity, material, spiritual, and mental. The physical or material body, called Khat, was liable to decay, and could only be preserved by mummifying. Both gods and man possessed bodies of this nature. When the material body had been brought to the tomb for burial, provided that the prescribed prayers had been said over it, and the proper ceremonies had been duly performed by the priests, it acquired the power of sending forth from itself a body called Sahu, which was able to ascend to heaven and to dwell with the gods there. The only suitable rendering for the word Sahu is spiritual body, and this meaning fits very well into the translation of the text where the word is found. The educated Egyptian never believed that the material body would rise again and take up a new life, for he well understood that flesh and blood could not inherit immortality. It has been urged by some that the custom of mummifying the dead, which obtained throughout Egypt for so many thousands of years, was maintained because the Egyptian believed in the resurrection of the material body, but it is not so. They mummified their dead simply because they believed that spiritual bodies would germinate in them. In several places it is distinctly said that the soul is in heaven and the body upon earth, and even the dead body of Osiris himself rested upon earth in Heliopolis. Elsewhere it is said to the deceased, "Thy soul is in heaven before Ra, thy Ka hath what should be given to it with the gods, thy Sahu hath power, or is glorious, with the Khus, and thy body Khat is stablished in the underworld Tuat." It is possible that certain simple folk may have been led to believe that because meat offerings and drink offerings in abundance were taken to the tombs, the deceased must naturally partake of them, and it is more than probable that the Egyptians in a semi-savage state made such offerings because they believed them necessary for their dead. The offerings taken to the tomb were intended for the Ka of the deceased. The word Ka has formed the subject of several learned dissertations by various scholars, and it is now generally rendered by double. It has its equivalent in the Coptic Ro and in the Greek Elaugon, and in certain places may be rendered by all the meanings of these equivalents. This abstract individuality or personality possessed all the attributes of the man himself, and though its normal dwelling place was in the tomb along with the body, it could wander about at will. It was independent of the man to whom it belonged, and could even go and dwell in the statue of a man. The Ka could both eat and drink, and at a very early period a small chamber was specially prepared for it in the hall of the tomb. This was provided with an opening through which it might snuff the smell of the incense and other offerings made therein, and it was the duty of certain members to minister duly and regularly to its needs. When actual offerings failed, it would seem that the Ka fed upon those which were painted or sculptured upon the walls and altars in the tomb, and when these were wanting, it appears that it might even be reduced to eating offal and drinking filthy water. Connected in some inexplicable way with the Ka was the Ba, or soul, which according to some texts is said to eat of the funeral offerings along with the Ka, in whom or with whom it was supposed to dwell, but according to others it ascended into heaven, where it lived with Ra and the beautiful dead. From one point of view it is not a material thing, and from another it is a tangible thing. It is depicted as a human-headed hawk, and in a vignette in the Papyrus of Nebket it is seen flying down the funeral pit bearing air and food to the mummified body lying in the mummy chamber to which it belongs. The Ba could leave its place in heaven and visit the body whenever it pleased, and it had power to assume any form which it pleased. Certain of the characteristics of the Ba were shared by the heart, Ab, which was believed to be the source both of life and of good and evil in man. The preservation of the heart was of the first importance, and several chapters of the Book of the Dead were composed with the object of keeping it out of the clutches of the stealers of hearts. In the judgment scene it is the one member of the body which is singled out for special examination, and the large numbers of heart amulets which are preserved in the national collections of Egyptian antiquities testify to the anxiety which the Egyptians felt as to its security. With the Ba, or soul, the Kaya bit, or shadow, is often mentioned, and it seems to have been nourished by the offerings which were made in the tomb of the man to whom it belonged. It had an existence apart from the body, and like the Ka, or double, it could wander wherever it pleased. An interesting passage concerning the shadow is found in the 92nd chapter of the Book of the Dead, where the deceased prays: O keep not captive my soul, O keep not ward over my shadow, but let a way be opened for my soul and for my shadow, and let them see the great God in the shrine on the day of the judgment of souls, and let them recite the utterances of Osiris, whose habitations are hidden to those who guard the members of Osiris, and who keep ward over the Khus, and who hold captive the shadows of the dead who would work evil against me. Another integral part of a man was the Khu, or shining, translucent covering of the spiritual body, which dwelt in heaven with the gods. It is difficult to explain its exact relationship to the double, and the soul, and the heart, and the shadow, but in certain passages in which the word occurs, it seems as if it had some close connection with the soul, for it is mentioned along with it. In several passages, both in early and late texts, the sekhem of a man is mentioned with the Ba, or soul, and sometimes with both the Ka, or double, and the Ba. One of the meanings of sekhem is form, or statue, but another meaning is power, and it seems as if the Egyptians conceived the idea of the power or vital force of a man living with him in heaven. The gods were supposed to possess doubles, and souls, and shadows, and hearts, and Khus, but it is doubtful if they were endowed with sekhem. It is probable that they were not. Many of them were themselves sekhem, or powers. There remains now but one attribute of a man to mention, and that is the ren, or name. In Egypt a man took the most extraordinary precautions to prevent his name from being blotted out, for it was the common belief that unless the name of a person were preserved he ceased to exist. Already in the Pyramid texts, as Dr. Wiedemann has pointed out, we find the deceased making supplication that his name may flourish, literally germinate, along with the names of Tem, Shu, Seb, and other gods, and the same desire is expressed in texts from the sixth dynasty down to the Roman period, when we find that a number of papyri were inscribed with invocations to one or more gods, with the sole object of making to flourish the names of those for whom they were copied. The ren, or name, had some close connection with the Ka, or double, as may be seen from the passage in the text of Pepi I. Thus we see that the Sahu, or spiritual body, the Ka, or double, the Ba, or soul, the Ab, or heart, the Khu, or shining form, the Sekhem, or vital force, and the Ren, or name, and the Kai bit, or shade, were all believed to come into existence after death, and it seems that the various parts which we have enumerated together made up the spiritual body which germinated in the Khat, or material body. There is little doubt that the beliefs in the existence of these various members of the spiritual body are not all of the same age, and they probably represent several stages of intellectual development on the part of the Egyptian. Their origin and development it is now impossible to trace, for already in the fifth and sixth dynasties their existence is accepted as an accomplished fact. A question naturally arises at this point as to when this spiritual body began its existence, but unfortunately no satisfactory answer can at present be given to it, for no text yet discovered supplies the necessary information. It is natural to suppose that the Sahu, or spiritual body, came into being as a result of the prayers which were recited on the day of the burial of the mummified body, and of the ceremonies which were performed at the same time. On the other hand, there exists distinct proofs that the Egyptians believed in a judgment which was to be held in the domain of Osiris, and we should hardly expect the spiritual body to begin its career until after the trial of the heart in the balance, and until the verdict of the gods at this judgment was favourable to the deceased. The whole question is full of difficulty, chiefly because the Egyptians themselves did not, I imagine, form definite ideas on such subjects, or if they did not put them in writing. It is, however, perfectly certain that they believed that Osiris had the power to make men to be born after death into a new life, and that such life was everlasting, and they ascribed to him this power because he had himself suffered death and mutilation and had risen from the dead. End of Introduction. Osiris and Resurrection. Introduction. The Judgment of the Egyptian Book of the Dead by EA Wallis Budge. An examination of the papyri inscribed with the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead shows that they may be divided into two classes, viz. 1. Those in which the chapters of coming forth by day are preceded by introductory hymns to Ra and Osiris, and by a judgment scene, and 2. Those in which they are preceded by a simple vignette in which the god Osiris is seen seated within a shrine. The oldest papyri of the 18th dynasty lack such introductory hymns, and the judgment scene, which appear most often in the illuminated papyri of the last half of the 18th dynasty. They continue in the 19th dynasty, but frequently in a less full form. In the older recensions of the Book of the Dead, there is no attempt to describe the judgment pictorially, and although it is pretty certain that every Egyptian believed that he would be judged after death, there is no definite statement of the fact. It will be noticed that a section of Chapter 30b contains the words, "My heart, my mother, my heart, my mother, my heart, whereby I came into being, may naught stand up to oppose me at my judgment. May there be no opposition to me in the presence of the sovereign princes of Osiris. May there be no parting of thee from me in the presence of him that keepeth the balance. Let there be joy of heart unto us at the weighing of words. Let not that which is false be uttered against me before the great God, the Lord of Amentet." Here clearly we have suggested the idea of weighing the heart as the symbol of the seat of life and the source of good and evil actions, and as a matter of fact the vignette of the chapter which first appears in the 18th dynasty represents the deceased sitting in one pan of the scales and being weighed against his heart, which is placed in the other. It is not easy to say exactly what belief underlies this vignette, but it seems to indicate that the guardian of the scale weighed the body to see if it had carried out properly the heart's directions, and that if it had done so it would counterbalance exactly the heart, and the beam of the scales would be straight. This testing of the body, or heart, or both, took place in the presence of Osiris on the day when words were weighed. In the Papyrus of Ani 4 small vignettes accompany the negative confession which forms part of the 125th chapter, and in one of these we see the heart of the deceased in one pan of the balance, and a feather, emblematic of right and truth, that is, what is straight, in the other. The god Anubis is testing the tongue of the balance, and close by stands the monster Am-met, or eater of the dead. Here we have a proof that in addition to the weighing of a man's body against his heart, the heart itself was weighed against right and truth, and that this stage of the judgment also took place in the presence of the god Osiris, the judge of the dead. In the 18th dynasty, if not earlier, the idea of the judgment took great hold upon the minds of the Egyptians, and it found expression in the large and elaborate vignette which is prefixed to the copies of the chapters of Coming Forth by Day which were made at this period. It is, however, impossible to say whether the large vignette is a development of that which accompanies the 125th chapter, or whether each had a distinct origin. When once the idea of the great judgment scene had developed itself, it seems to have been felt that the deceased ought not to enter into the hall of judgment without having first uttered words of prayer and praise to the great gods Ra and Osiris, to the former as the greatest of the cosmic gods, and to the latter as the judge and god of the dead. Hence were composed the introductory hymns to Ra and Osiris, of which several examples are known. In the hymns to Ra, the deceased apostrophizes the glory and majesty of the one God, the creator of the world and all that therein is, who manifests himself to his creatures under the form of the sun, and by whose heat and light men and women, beasts and feathered fowl, fish and creeping things, trees and herbs have their being. The darkness of night into which the sun disappeared when he set was personified as an enemy of the sun, and the daily victory of light over darkness was hymned with gladness by his worshippers. From one point of view the Egyptian regarded the course of the sun as a type of his own life, and day symbolized life, and night death. The conflict in which the sun engaged with the powers of darkness typified the struggle of the deceased with his enemies in the underworld, and man hoped that he would overcome them, even as the sun vanquished all who opposed his course. In a fine hymn the deceased says, "O thou beautiful being, thou dost renew thyself in thy season in the form of the disk within thy mother Hathor. Therefore in every place every heart swelleth with joy at thy rising eternally. O Ra, the divine man child, the heir of eternity, self-begotten and self-born, prince of the Tuat, governor of the regions of Okert, thou god of life, thou lord of love, all men live when thou shinest. Thou art crowned king of the gods. Those who are in thy following sing unto thee with joy, and bow down their foreheads to the earth when they meet thee. Thou lord of heaven, thou lord of earth, thou king of right and truth, thou lord of eternity, thou prince of everlastingness, thou sovereign of all the gods, thou god of life, thou creator of eternity, thou maker of heaven wherein thou art firmly established. The company of the gods rejoice at thy rising. The earth is glad when it beholdeth thy rays. The peoples that have been long dead come forth with cries of joy to see thy beauties daily. The serpent fiend, that is darkness, hath fallen, his arms are hewn off, the knife hath cut asunder his joints. Ra liveth in unchanging and eternal law and order." Again, in another hymn, we read, "Thou risest, thou risest, thou shinest, thou shinest. Thou art crowned king of the gods. Thou art the lord of heaven, thou art the lord of earth. Thou art the creator of beings celestial and of beings terrestrial. Thou art the one God who came into being in the beginning of time. Thou didst create the earth, thou didst fashion man, thou didst make the watery abyss of the sky, thou didst form Hapi, that is the Nile. Thou didst create the watery abyss, and didst give life to all that therein is. Thou hast knit together the mountains, thou hast made mankind and the beasts of the field to come into being, thou hast made the heavens and the earth. Thou art crowned Prince of Heaven, thou art the one dowered with all sovereignty, who comest forth from the sky. Ra is victorious, O thou divine youth, thou heir, literally flesh and bone, of everlastingness, thou self-begotten one, O thou who didst give thyself birth, O one mighty one of myriad forms and aspects, King of the world, Prince of Anu, Lord of eternity, and ruler of everlastingness, the company of the gods rejoice when thou risest and when thou sailest across the sky. Thou art unknown, and no tongue is worthy to declare thy likeness. Only thou thyself canst do this. Thou hearest with thine ears, and thou seest with thine eyes. Millions of years have gone over the world. I cannot tell the number of those through which thou hast passed. From these passages it is clear that the Egyptians believed that the God who was typified by the sun was eternal, immortal, and unknown, that is, invisible, that he created himself and the world and the beings and things in it. He was also one and alone, and there was none like unto him, for the gods of whom he was king only possessed certain of his attributes and characteristics. It had been denied by some that his oneness or unity is the same as the unity of God Almighty, though I believe there is no good reason for this view. But whether it be or not, it is perfectly certain that when the Egyptians declared that their God was one, they meant exactly what the Hebrews meant when they declared that Jehovah was one, and what the Arabs meant and still mean when they cry out that Allah is one. At all events, the one God of the Egyptians possessed all the essential attributes of the Christians' God. In the hymns to Osiris, the deceased enumerates the various titles of the god and mentions his most ancient shrines. Osiris is declared to be the son of Seb, the earth god, and of Nut, the sky goddess, and as prince of gods and men to have received the crook and the whip and the dignity of his divine fathers. He is the king of eternity and lord of everlastingness, and his existence is for millions of years. In his name Osiris he is most terrible, and he endureth for ever in his name Un-Nefer. Though possessing the attribute of eternal which is ascribed to Ra, he is not self-begotten and self-born like that god. Ra has no offspring in the human sense of the word, but Osiris begot a son after his death, according to one legend, who succeeded to his father's throne upon earth and avenged him on Set, his murderer. From Ra the deceased asks only that he may behold him at dawn each day, but from Osiris he asks that his Ka, or double, may have splendour in heaven and might upon earth and triumph in the underworld. And he adds, may I sail down to Tatu, Mendes, or Busiris like a living soul, and up to Abtu, Abydos, like a Bennu bird. May I go in and come out without repulse at the pylons of the lords of the underworld. May there be given unto me loaves of bread in the house of coolness, and offerings of food in Annu, Heliopolis, and a homestead forever in Sekhet Aru, with wheat and barley therefore. Judging by the arrangement of the Papyrus of Ani, the Papyrus of Hu Nefer, the Papyrus of Qenna, and other documents of the period, it seems pretty clear that the introductory hymns and the vignette of the judgment scene together formed a special section of the fine papyri of the Theban Recension. The vignette of the judgment scene varies in detail greatly in the various papyri. though the essential parts of it are always preserved. The fullest form known of it is given in the Papyrus of Ani, and may be thus described: in one portion of a chamber in the domain of Osiris, which we may assume to be the hall of the double Maat, or right and truth, a balance is set, wherein the heart of the deceased is to be weighed. The beam of the balance is suspended upon a projection from the standard made in the form of the feather which symbolizes right and truth. Upon the beam of the balance sits the dog-headed ape, which was associated with Thoth, the scribe of the gods. The weighing of the heart is carried out in the presence of the company of the gods, which is here represented by the following members of it: 1. Ra Heru Khuti, or Ra Harmachis, the great god within his boat. This boat was called the bark of millions of years, and there sat in it, along with Ra, the gods Khepera and Tem, his own forms in the morning and evening respectively. 2. Temu or Tem, the form of Ra at eventide. He was the head of the company of gods at Heliopolis, and is always represented in human form. This fact indicates that already in the earliest times known to us he had gone through all the various stages through which gods pass, and had assumed a final and definite form. 3. Shu, the son of Ra, and Hathor, who lifted up the goddess Nut, or the sky, from the embrace of Seb, the earth god. He typified the light. 4. Tefnut, the twin sister of Shu. She is depicted as a woman with the head of a lioness. She typified moisture. 5. Seb, the earth god, the son of Shu, husband of Nut, and by her father of Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys. 6. Nut, the female counterpart of Nu, or the watery mass from which all the gods were evolved, and upon which the bark of millions of years floated. 7. Isis, the sister wife of Osiris, the mother of Horus, son of Isis. She probably typified the dawn. 8. Nephthys, daughter of Seb and Nut, sister of Osiris and Isis, and the sister wife of Set. She is also said to be the mother of Anubis by Osiris. She probably typified eventide, or twilight. 9. Horus, the sun god, who is to be distinguished from Horus, the son of Isis. He is represented in human form, but with the head of a hawk. The hawk was the symbol of Horus, and the worship of that bird is probably the oldest in Egypt. 10. Hathor, the goddess of that portion of the sky wherein Horus, the sun god, rose and set. 11. Hu and Sa, two gods who had their places in the boat of the sun at creation. It will be noticed that several of the gods, for example, Nu, Ptah, Khnemu, Khepera, Set, Anpu, Apuat, Amsu, Hapi, and several goddesses, for example, Maat Nit, Sekhet, Bast, Serk, Uatchit, are not here represented. The explanation of this fact is that only the gods and the goddesses of the funeral company of Osiris are considered to be interested in the judgment of the dead. On one side of the scale we see the god Anubis testing the tongue of the balance, and behind him stand Thoth, the scribe of the gods, writing down the result of the weighing, and the triform beast Ammit, the eater of the dead, who is waiting to devour the heart of Ani should it be found light in the balance. On the other side of the balance are Ani's luck, or destiny, an object called Meskin, which has been described as a cubit with human head. It either typifies the embryo, or has some connection with the birth of Ani. His soul in the form of a human-headed bird perched upon a pylon, and behind these are the goddesses Renenet and Mekhenet, who presided over Ani's birth chamber and rearing. Behind these stand Ani himself and his wife Thuthu, with heads reverently bent. Ani is here depicted in human form, and wearing garments and ornaments similar to those which he wore upon earth. It is quite clear that the body which he has in this hall of judgment cannot be the body with which he had been endowed upon earth, and we are probably to understand that it is his spiritual body, wearing the white robes of the beatified dead in the world beyond the grave, which we see. He is perfect in all his members, which are endowed with the strength and power that belong to those who have risen in a spiritual or glorified body from the dead. Though he stands at the entrance of the hall, and the weighing of the heart has not yet taken place, the artist depicted him in the form in which it was always assumed the just would appear before Osiris. The heart having been placed in one pan of the scales, and the feather, symbolic of truth, in the other, Ani utters the words which form Chapter XXX-B of the Book of the Dead, wherein he prays that there may be no parting of his heart from him in the presence of the guardian of the balance. This done, Anubis tests the tongue of the balance, and finds that the beam is exactly straight, and that the heart balances the feather exactly. The dog-headed ape, seated on the standard, reports this to Thoth, who, standing with his writing reed in hand, is ready to note the result and to declare it to the gods. It is interesting to observe that the heart was only required to balance the feather, and not to outweigh it, a fact which indicates that the pious Egyptian was supposed to be able to satisfy the demands and requirements of the law, and that he took his stand in the judgment and hoped for acquittal by virtue of the good deeds which he had done in the body. The god Thoth next addressed the company of the gods as follows: "Hear ye this judgment. The heart of Osiris hath in very truth been weighed, and his soul hath stood as a witness for him. It hath been found true by trial in the great balance. There hath not been found any wickedness in him. He hath not wasted the offerings in the temples. He hath not done harm by his deeds, and he spread no evil reports about men while he was upon earth." To this speech the gods reply: "That which cometh forth from thy mouth, O Thoth, dwelling in Khemennu, is confirmed. Osiris the scribe Ani is holy and righteous. He hath not sinned, neither hath he done evil against us. The devourer Amemet shall not be allowed to prevail over him, and meat offerings and entrance into the presence of the god Osiris shall be granted unto him, together with a homestead for ever in Sekhet Hetepu, as unto the followers of Horus." The gods confirm the report of Thoth, and Ani, having been found just, is led into the presence of Osiris by Horus, the son of Isis. The words "found just" represent in a measure the words Ma Keru or Ma'ut Keru, masculine, feminine, which are always added after the name of the deceased in funeral texts. There is no example of their application to a living person. Much has been written about them, and many renderings have been suggested for them, such as true of voice, justified, triumphant, victorious. They actually mean right Ma and word Keru, and seem to be meant to express the belief on the part of the writer that the deceased has satisfactorily passed the ordeal of judgment, and that he has attained to the state in which his commands, whatever they may be, will be carried out duly and effectually. While Horus is leading Ani into the presence of his father, he addresses Osiris, saying: "I have come unto thee, O Un Nefer, and I have brought thee Osiris Ani unto thee. His heart has been found righteous coming forth from the balance, and it hath not sinned against any god or goddess. Thoth hath weighed it according to the decree uttered unto him by the company of the gods, and it is very true and righteous. Grant unto him cakes and ale, and let him enter into the presence of Osiris, that is, into thy presence. And may he be like unto the followers of Horus for ever." In the last division of the judgment scene we see Ani kneeling by a table of offerings placed before the shrine of the god Osiris, to whom he says: "O Lord of Amentet, I am in thy presence. There is no sin in me. I have not lied wittingly, nor have I done aught with a false heart. Grant that I may be like unto those favoured ones who are round about thee, and that I may be an Osiris, greatly favoured of the beautiful God, and beloved of the Lord of the world. The royal scribe, indeed, who loveth him, Ani, triumphant before the god Osiris. It will be noticed that Ani now has his hair whitened, and that he wears upon his head the object which is called a cone, the signification of which is unknown. He has at length penetrated to the throne of Osiris, the Lord of eternity, as the words written above read, and Ani's petition to the god is that he may become an Osiris, that is to say, a being endowed with a spiritual body which can never again see death or suffer corruption. The answer of Osiris is not given in the papyrus, nor is it, as far as I have seen, in any papyrus where a similar petition is made, but just as it is always assumed that the heart of the deceased will always balance the feather of law or right and truth, so is it also assumed that the petition of the deceased will always be favourably received, and that he will henceforth be free to go about in the god's domains without let or hindrance, and to participate in all the occupations of the great god himself. Thus the judgment scene ends, and this section of the papyrus in which it is found is followed by the chapters of coming forth by day. The question naturally arises here: when did the judgment in the hall of Osiris take place? To this no definite answer can be given, for the reason that no text supplies the information needed. There are no grounds, so far as I see, for assuming that the Egyptians believed in a great general day of judgment, when all the world shall be judged, and the wicked shall be punished, and the righteous shall be rewarded, or for thinking, as some have done, that the mummified bodies were laid in the tomb to await a general resurrection. On the contrary, all the evidence seems to point to the conclusion that the judgment of each individual was thought to take place immediately after death. And if this was the belief, it follows that punishment or reward was allotted to the dead at once. The evil heart, or the heart which had failed to balance the feather symbolic of the law, was given to the monster Ammit to devour. Thus punishment consisted of instant annihilation, unless we imagine that the destruction of the heart was extended over an indefinite period. The difficulty of the subject is further complicated when we come to consider the use and object of the funeral ceremonies and prayers. If, at his death, the soul of a man passed to immediate judgment, what could the ceremonies and prayers of the priests avail it? We know that the embalming of a body in the best and most expensive way occupied a period varying from 70 to about 100 days, and that several more days were necessary before the body was coffined and laid with the proper ceremonies in the tomb. If the prayers which the priests recited and the ceremonies which they performed over it at the grave were absolutely necessary for the future well-being of its soul, and if the soul could not begin its beatified existence until such prayers had been said and such ceremonies had been performed, it is difficult to understand why such a lengthy process of embalmment was resorted to. For during the period which elapsed between death and burial, the soul must have tarried in some intermediate place. In the absence of exact knowledge, we can only assume that certain prayers were said for the benefit of the deceased immediately after death, and that such prayers assured his acquittal in the hall of Osiris, and procured for him entrance into the abode of the blessed. This done, the embalmment of the body might be carried out at the convenience of all concerned, and the elaborate and formal ceremonies connected with the sepulture of the great would follow in due course. The beliefs which are connected with the judgment of the dead are so numerous and so conflicting, and belong to so many various periods of development of religious thought in Egypt, that it is impossible to harmonize them. As new texts are discovered, the difficulties will probably disappear one by one, and the future labours of Egyptologists will clear up many obscure passages which up to the present have been misunderstood. End of Introduction. The Judgment.